My name is Mackenzie Vance. I am 32 years old. 6 months ago, on a formal Sunday, my mother-in-law, Amanda, slid a gold-embossed parchment folder across the dinner table, looked at my husband, Gabriel, and said, "I think you need to see this." She had secretly DNA tested our 3-year-old daughter, Lily, to invalidate her eligibility for a $1,500,000 bloodline trust. Amanda expected a clinical execution of my marriage. She did not expect those results to audit her own unvouched history, turning her weapon into the precise asset that permanently liquidated her entire legacy. At that exact moment, when a long-term betrayal is slid across the dinner table under the guise of family honor, would you have reacted instantly in anger? Or would you have stayed perfectly quiet to see exactly how far they were willing to go? Regulating an unstable structure requires careful, continuous documentation. I had spent 7 years as a silent investor in their version of family, mapping the fractures before I understood the true depth of the systemic rot. Long before that Sunday folder materialized, Amanda treated our relationship like a high-friction, conditional lease one, where she reserved the right to audit the premises without regulatory notice. My own professional foundation was completely independent. As an architectural restoration consultant specializing in historic masonry preservation, I brought in an annual revenue of $150,000. I did not need the Vance legacy, nor did I require a financial subscription to their social standing. Yet, from the afternoon Gabriel first brought me to the family's traditional estate in Savannah, Amanda audited my biological provenance with the cold distance of a hostile building inspector searching for a terminal zoning violation. She checked my family metrics, catalogued my mother's lack of capital, and logged my missing father like a structural deficiency in an appraisal report. At the time, I believed I was simply deploying professional patience, but I was actually training them to view my boundaries as negotiable assets. Every holiday became an exercise in corporate compliance, a performance where my presence was tolerated only because Gabriel had signed over his psychological autonomy years before I arrived. When we secured our townhome in the High Preservation Historic District, 40 minutes from her estate, she insisted on holding a master key under the legal pretext of emergency access, but Amanda did not recognize sovereign property lines. She would materialize on random Tuesdays, entering through the side courtyard while I was evaluating state restoration contracts to physically rearrange our personal environments. She shifted spice racks, reorganized linen closets by ancestral thread count, and left small, typed index cards detailing my domestic non-compliance under the mask of maternal care. Gabriel consistently normalized the incursions. As a structural engineer, he could calculate load-bearing physics perfectly, but his emotional circuitry had been wired early to avoid maternal collisions at any cost. He told me it was just her way of managing her investment, completely misinterpreting her structural surveillance for protective security. He had learned early that the fastest route to surviving Amanda was the complete, quiet liquidation of his own voice. I watched his sister, Caitlin, rotate in that same narrow, suffocating orbit, acting as a small, dependent satellite with no independent trajectory of her own. At family functions, the subtext was always clinical, a continuous verbal assessment reminding the room that Gabriel could have merged his capital with any elite pedigree in the city. I kept my position perfectly level and my records clean, refusing to overdraft my emotional reserves on an institutional structure built entirely on a fraudulent ledger. My daughter's eyes held an unlisted structural variation. It was a congenital sector iris variation, a precise fraction of her left eye that displayed a slate-grey pigment, completely detached from the uniform amber running through the Vance ancestral registry. To an ordinary observer, it was a beautiful physical anomaly, but Amanda evaluated the trait as an undocumented material defect in the family pedigree. She began a systematic campaign of strategic profiling, transforming our formal family luncheons into a theatre for auditing my child's physical traits. I watched her look into Lily's eyes, not with the affection of a grandmother, but with the cold distance of a customs officer checking an immigration file for a forged visa stamp. Atypical colouring, she murmured over her white wine, allowing the silence to settle across the mahogany like dust in a closed vault. Nothing like this has ever been recorded in the Vance Trust Registry records. Right on cue, Caitlin acted as her digital compliance officer, uploading a portrait of Lily to her networks with a passive-aggressive caption questioning her unique provenance, securing hundreds of superficial votes of curiosity to isolate my position within the extended family. Only later did I understand what that intense boundary policing really meant. The psychology of aggressive lineage gatekeeping is rarely about preserving historical truth. It is an active emotional projection designed to overcompensate for a severe, hidden, structural flaw in the validator's own historical foundation. Amanda was obsessively measuring our parameters because she knew her own identity framework could not withstand a forensic survey. The first real friction materialized on a wet Tuesday afternoon when I returned from a prolonged restoration site evaluation to pick up Lily from the estate. Within 48 hours, I discovered her custom, medical-grade silicone teething ring, an item carrying the family's engraved monogram, had been removed from her diaper bag. When I noted the anomaly, Amanda dismissed it with smooth financial indifference, claiming the item looked worn and had been replaced by a generic store-bought alternative. She lied with absolute structural confidence, adjusting her pearls while looking directly at my face. I knew she had harvested a biological sample to execute an illicit genetic audit, but I faced a realistic, grueling delay. Navigating corporate data systems and verifying unauthorized laboratory files requires weeks of absolute silence, forcing me to carry the psychological weight of this violation with completely incomplete information. I didn't push back when she lied about that missing teething ring, because I was already tracking an encrypted data trail that was about to turn her entire audit upside down. Procedural discipline is the quietest countermeasure against systemic theft. Instead of entering into a high-friction domestic dispute with Gabriel, who was still emotionally overdrawn by his family liabilities, I shifted the ledger entirely into formal professional networks. I retained a premier family estate attorney and allocated a $750 capital expense for a specialized, independent genetic privacy audit. There would be no frantic shouting matches, no tears, and no cinematic confrontations in our historic district home. I simply treated Amanda's illicit surveillance as a corporate risk factor to be legally contained and systematically neutralized. What stayed with me through those 48 hours wasn't the violation itself, but the calm certainty that the legal parameters were entirely on my side. Because I had previously logged Lily's unique genetic profile with a secure privacy lock at Geneva Laboratories during her infant health screening, the system was fully fortified. 2 weeks before the Sunday dinner execution, this encryption layer triggered an automated compliance notification from the laboratory, which handles certified genetic profiling for estate registries. The data analysts flagged an unauthorized submission for a minor, Lily Vance. Initiated by an unverified third party, listed as an estate trustee under the name of Amanda Vance. Because the clinical facility faced strict regulatory protocols regarding minor privacy, the entire file had been placed on a temporary administrative hold pending written parental authorization. The laboratory representative requested an immediate directive: proceed with verification or liquidate the transaction. I instructed the facility to formally cancel the clinical ledger, flag the file for unauthorized identity exposure, and secure a certified copy of the forged authorization documents for my legal counsel. There were no instantaneous legal judgments or magical database interventions. Everything moved at the standard, slow-moving pace of compliance bureaucracies. But the administrative audit revealed an incomplete loop in Amanda's strategy. In her absolute arrogance, she had concurrently cross-submitted a secondary biological sample to an open consumer ancestry platform, an unregulated network that relied on simple digital checkboxes to bypass parental signature verification. She believed that by utilizing a decentralized consumer database, she could secure a shadow paternity report to manipulate Gabriel without triggering an institutional alarm. I started to realize that the most dangerous traps are the ones built out of pure arrogance, where the person laying the wires is so certain of their immunity that they forget to check who owns the database. I did not cancel the consumer platform transaction. I left the digital tracking profile completely active, allowing her illicit data upload to sit quietly inside the open system, waiting for the global cross-referencing algorithm to complete its processing cycle. In her frantic haste to secure the evidence for Sunday dinner, Amanda printed the generated report package the moment the primary paternity percentage appeared, entirely blind to the automated family matches, silently anchoring themselves to the final pages. Maintaining an unyielding domestic perimeter requires complete internal containment. For 5 days leading up to that Sunday execution, I operated as the sole custodian of a liability that would completely re-index the Vance legacy. I did not break my professional timeline. I reviewed architectural preservation blueprints, filed structural restoration appraisals, and managed my independent consulting accounts with absolute metric precision. Every evening, I returned to our historic district townhome to cook dinner for Lily, ensuring her personal environment remained entirely insulated from the corporate manoeuvring taking place outside our walls. I was drafting a silent legal injunction behind our normal family routine, building an ironclad safety net to protect my daughter's sanctuary while carrying the massive cognitive load of her grandmother's betrayal alone. I can admit now that part of me saw the fractures earlier than I wanted to. Watching Gabriel come home exhausted from his structural engineering projects, his shoulders carrying the uncalculated weight of years of maternal conditioning, brought a dull ache to my chest. He was a critical beam under severe mechanical stress, yet he remained completely blind to the reality that his mother was prepping a public execution for his marriage. I chose not to interrupt his timeline prematurely. Truncating the sequence before every asset was secured would only trigger an emotional defense mechanism, allowing Amanda to deploy her standard performative apologies and keep the toxic cycle intact. Instead, I managed the operational friction of the Ancestry database. Friction point 2 materialized when the consumer platform's matching system hit a temporary wall of unverified variables. The algorithm had flagged a primary genetic connection, but the user profile was highly secure, listed only as Julian M., age 36, residing right here in Savannah. I refused to move on an incomplete assessment. In my line of work, rushing a restoration before verifying the underlying material properties leads to catastrophic failure. For 3 consecutive nights, while Gabriel slept, I sat in the dim light of my office desk, utilizing advanced genetic genealogy to map Julian's shared maternal matches and cross-referencing them with historical vital records from 1990 and his own later academic registries. The room felt smaller than before as the hours ticked past midnight. The silence of the historic district outside my window wasn't peaceful. It was a holding pattern, a baseline against which the digital data columns on my monitor seemed to hum with cold energy. I reverse-engineered his digital family tree line by line, tracing the maternal cousin clusters that Amanda's old money wealth couldn't delete from an open-source database. It was a tedious, unromantic accounting of a woman's calculated flight from her own biology. I tracked the anomalies line by line, calculating dates and verification records, until the chronological timeline aligned with absolute, mathematically undeniable precision. Carrying the unshared truth alone in a quiet house teaches you that power doesn't belong to the person who speaks loudest, but to the one who holds the data until the exact moment the alignment is flawless. On Friday afternoon, I stood in the doorway of a local archive and watched a man handle a centuries-old manuscript, completely unaware that he shared a jawline with my husband and a secret with my mother-in-law. The folder sat between us like a loaded weapon. We had reached the exact midpoint of Amanda's carefully orchestrated Sunday dinner, the clearing of the main course serving as the cue for her formal entrance. Caitlin adjusted her posture, her leg bouncing in rhythmic synchronization with the clock, waiting for the structural collapse she believed was coming. Amanda stood at the head of the table, smoothing her tailored silk blouse with an archival flourish. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with the clinical cadence of an institutional trustee delivering a performance review. She spoke of ancestral provenance, the strict boundary lines of the Vance Trust, and the moral liability of ignoring material anomalies in the family lineage. With a slow, elegant rotation of her wrist, She slid the gold-embossed folder across the white damask cloth, landing it precisely between Gabriel's silver water goblet and his left hand. "Open it, Gabriel," she said, her voice dropping into a register of calculated maternal pity. "No offence to Mackenzie, but this family deserves an unvouched ledger, and you have a right to know the precise metrics of your own home." That's when I observed the fundamental liability of her architecture. The ultimate vulnerability of an abuser is their unshakable belief that their targets are too intimidated to check the underlying registry. I sat perfectly still at the far end of the mahogany, my hands folded, letting the silence drain the oxygen from the room until Amanda's certainty began to feel heavy. Gabriel broke the wax seal with the steady, mechanical hands of an engineer checking a diagnostic report. The room fell into an absolute, suffocating structural freeze. For 20 seconds, the only sound was the metallic ticking of the long case clock against the wall. He scanned the laboratory letterhead, his jaw working as his eyes logged the certified data points from the registry file. When he looked up, his alignment had completely shifted. "The probability of paternity is 99.9998%, he said, his voice entirely flat, stripped of his usual compliance. "Lily is my daughter. The audit is complete." Amanda's face didn't drop. It fractured, a subtle structural failure running through her eyes as she reached forward to liquidate the folder before anyone else could scan the contents. But I did not allow the sequence to terminate. "The paternity results are correct, Amanda," I said, my voice carrying more weight than volume. "But you only looked at the parameters you wanted to expose. Gabriel, turn to page 4. Read the familial match registry from the open platform." He flipped past the clinical disclosures, past the unauthorized consent documents, until he reached the automated network update. He read the archival match aloud, his cadence slowing down as the reality hit the table. "Julian M., age 36, Savannah, rare book archivist. Relationship estimate to test taker, half uncle, sharing 12.5% DNA, signalling an unlisted sibling in Gabriel's own generation." The heavy silver serving dishes stayed flat on the table, but the generational silence broke wide open when my husband looked up and asked his mother a single question: "Who is Julian?" The archive was open now. I reached into my restoration briefcase and laid down a secondary file, Julian's certified non-identifying adoption health history from 1990, legally obtained through his adult registry access. Amanda's suffocating composure completely failed her as the documents hit the table. I did not raise my pitch. I simply laid out the factual provenance of her own deception. "The sector iris variation isn't an anomaly introduced by my lineage, Amanda," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy quiet with absolute clinical weight. "It belongs entirely to you." In that heavy quiet, I realized something fundamental about the structures people build around their own shame. She had spent 40 years maintaining a flawless facade, entirely unaware that a genetic blueprint can never be truly dyed, corrected, or written out of the ledger by a board vote. Her entire 7-year persecution of my identity was nothing more than an intensive defense mechanism to protect her own manufactured image. The documentation verified the exact parameters. As a young woman desperate to secure her marriage into the Vance old money elite, Amanda had contracted a private prosthetic clinic to manufacture custom-tinted, hand-painted prescription contact lenses to mask her sectoral heterochromia. She had inherited the trait from an ostracized, non-pedigreed branch of her family line, and she chose to physically obscure her biology every single morning for 40 years, rather than face structural exclusion. 2 years prior to her marriage to Charles, she had secretly given birth to Julian in Hartford, Connecticut, signed over her parental rights to a private adoption agency, and buried the entire timeline under decades of pristine Foundation reports. There was no theatrical explosion of anger from my father-in-law. Charles Vance had spent his entire career in maritime logistics, managing critical system variables. He did not engage in domestic screaming matches. He looked at the historical photographs, looked at his wife's unclipped pearl earrings, and executed a cold, institutional response. Without a single word, he calmly stood up from his chair, collected his telephone, and exited the dining room. Through the tall windows, I could see him standing in the courtyard under the golden hour light, immediately dialing his corporate trust attorneys to initiate a full forensic audit and freeze every single asset connected to the family foundation. Caitlin sat paralysed across from me, her fingers moving automatically to delete the predatory social media campaigns she had spent weeks broadcasting. Her support network had vanished in the space of a single disclosure. Amanda reached across the mahogany, her fingers trembling as she clawed at the medical sheets, her voice reduced to an unvouched whisper. But Gabriel stepped between us, his posture completely detached from her hands. That singular moment marked the final structural shift from a tense family dinner to a permanent, legally enforced landscape of estrangement. Institutional structures take time to settle into permanent containment. 6 months have passed since that Sunday dinner, and the consequences have matured with realistic, slow-moving precision. Amanda was not ruined overnight, nor was she cast out of her historic estate. Her material lifestyle remains completely intact, but her systemic power over our family has been permanently liquidated. To preserve the Vance Foundation's public reputation from structural exposure, she was quietly forced to step down from her position as board trustee, her name removed from the official registry she spent her entire life policing. Charles remains living on the periphery of her environment, his cold, administrative silence speaking with more finality than a formal legal brief. Gabriel executed the separation of our family assets with the exact mathematical clarity he uses for structural engineering. He signed an ironclad legal division of all inheritance holdings, ensuring Lily's future is completely insulated from any maternal interference. He and Julian meet twice a month in quiet Savannah archives, slowly tracing back the 36 years of family history that had been systematically erased from the ledger. They are 2 versions of the same original blueprint, reconstructing their connection, one honest conversation at a time. Caitlin exists in a distant neutrality now, her social media channels wiped clean of Amanda's influence, while Amanda herself remains completely isolated from our home, the permanent emptiness of her chair carrying a definitive legal weight. The gold-embossed parchment folder sits inside the bottom drawer of my restoration desk. I never discarded it. It doesn't carry emotional value. It serves as a simple metric of structural calibration, a reminder that the precise weapon someone manufactures to execute your marriage can become the exact instrument that secures your long-term sovereignty. I look at the structural changes in our life now and realise that some historical frameworks cannot be safely restored. They have to be condemned, so a completely safe life can be built in their place. At work, I document material anomalies in millimetres, waiting for the physical equilibrium to hold. In family, I have learned that the real truth does not require a public stage, a curated audience, or a performance slid across a dinner table. It simply requires the quiet courage to stop cooperating with a system designed to keep you small. Have you ever had to stand completely alone in an environment that expected you to break, only to realise that the empirical truth you carried was the very asset that made your boundaries unyielding? If this narrative resonated with your own lived experience, I would be deeply grateful to hear your perspective on how you found your own quiet power when everything around you felt unstable.